Speakers, dear listeners, good evening. As Director of the House of European History, I would like to warmly welcome you to the debate, The Europes That Emerged in 1945. This event is part of the Debating History series, which has taken place in the museum's auditorium since its opening just exactly today, 3 years ago. Post-war Europe is an important part of the House of European History's permanent exhibition, which attempts to depict common European developments while at the same time pointing at a diversity of experiences in different countries. This multi-perspective and transnational view is what we aim to convey throughout all our programs. I'm therefore very grateful that we can count tonight on historians from 5 different countries. Let me introduce them to you in alphabetical order. Pieter Lagrou teaches contemporary history at the Université Libre de Bruxelles. He has published on the legacy of World War II, war crime trials, and the challenges of writing European history. He's currently working on a book of popular sovereignty. Olga Malinova is professor of the School of Politics and Governance at National Research University Higher School of Economics and Chief Research Fellow of the Institute of Scientific Information for Social Sciences, Russian Academy of Sciences. The fields of her research interests are politics of memory and symbolic politics. Božo Repe is a full professor of contemporary history at the Faculty of Arts, University of Ljubljana. Since 2009, he has been the project manager of the group Slovene History. His research area includes contemporary Slovene, Southern Slavic, and Central European history. Tatjana Tönsmeyer is professor of modern European history at Wuppertal University in Germany since 2011. Her specific field of interest is the history of World War II, with a focus on everyday life during occupation in a pan-European perspective. Last, but really not least, the former chair of our academic committee, Włodzimierz Borodziej, is professor for contemporary history at Warsaw University. His research has focused, among others, on resistance in World War II, Polish-German relations, and the history of World War I. I would like to thank the speakers and the moderator for their virtual presence tonight. The first ever House of European History online debate. A warm welcome. Please note that our listeners can ask questions to the panelists through the chat on the YouTube channel. They will be shared with the speakers at the end of their discussion so that they can react to all questions. I wish everyone a fruitful European discussion on the World Wide Web, and now hand over to Professor Borodziej. Thank you very much for being here.
Good evening. I would like to start first with my happiness that we are successful in gathering such a prominent panel from all over Europe, and with a mission statement of the House of European History, which is our host. There is a wonderful sentence in Robert Musil's Mann ohne Eigenschaften, which is unfortunately not very well known to the younger generation, in which Musil says that an inhabitant of a country has at least 9 characters: a professional, national, a civic, a class, geographical, sexual, conscious, unconscious, and possibly even a private character. What the House of European History is about is to add to these 9 characters a 10th, which is kind of European identity, which turns out to be very difficult during these days. This event was considered to precede celebrations on May 8th and May 9th in Moscow, which will not take place. Still, anything we see, we read in the press, in the social media, proves that this is a kind of a very difficult day of memory. Though theoretically uniting Europeans, it's dividing them. So let's now come back to the situation of Victory in Europe Day, May 8th or 9th. Peter, how would you describe it?
Yes, well, tonight, the 4th of May 2020, is the first time in 75 years that there will only be a virtual commemoration on the Dam Square in central Amsterdam. For the last 3/4 of a century, on the evening of the 4th of May, the Netherlands have commemorated the war dead in the Netherlands on the evening of the 4th to celebrate the victory in the Second World War on the 5th. And now only the King, the Queen, Prime Minister will be present at the monument, and this will be broadcasted, and people will be invited to bring, to deliver virtual flowers on different virtual monuments on the internet. Now, why do the Netherlands choose the 4th and the 5th of May rather than the 8th or the 9th? Well, because the surrender of the German armies in the Netherlands was signed on the 4th of May, and it became effective on the 5th of May. So different European countries have different dates, and these dates mean different things in different places. Even in the Netherlands, the 4th and the 5th of May were important in the northern part and the central part of the Netherlands, which has known German occupation till that day, which had lived through a very severe hunger winter in the last year of war, while the south of the country had been liberated already in September, like most of Belgium and most of France, who were liberated in the late summer of 1944. For Italy, the dates are very different, starting in October 43 in the south and ending on the 25th of April 1945. So different areas of Europe remember the end of the war on different moments. And the fact that different localities know different dates, for instance, explains that in Belgium and in France, the 8th of May neither have the same strong significance as the 11th of November, that is the end of the First World War, which was really one single date. So I think it might be interesting just to move around Europe, and after the Dam Square in Amsterdam, I would like to take you to 3 other places to just try to think what the May 1945 meant for them. One place I would like to take you is Dresden. We are in Dresden, we are in May 1945 with a family of German refugees from Silesia. They are farmers from Silesia who fled in the advance of the Red Army. And in May 1945, the war is over. They are in the Soviet occupation zone, and they decide that they will simply go home. So by the end of May, they simply go back home to Silesia, which has now become Polish territory. When they move back into their farm, there's a Polish family living in their farm. And the Polish family explains that they have been expelled from Galicia, which has now become Soviet Ukraine. And so those 2 refugee families then decide that there's a lot of work to do. Harvest is coming. So they divide the farm. They live together in this farm until this Polish family is discovered by the German family is discovered by the Polish authorities and sent back to Germany. So here we see the shared fate of a Polish and a German family in Silesia in May 1945. Another place would be a gigantic British POW camp in occupied Belgium, well, in liberated Belgium, just outside of Bruges, the camp of Zedelgem. 60,000 POWs, 12,000 of them are Latvian legionnaires. These Latvian legionnaires absolutely do not want to go back to Latvia, which has now become Soviet territory. And so they certainly do not celebrate the end of the war, because the end of the war for them means possibly forceful repatriation to the Soviet Union, where they will be brought to trial. In the end, they are never forcefully repatriated. Some of them marry to girls in the area. Most of them migrate to the United States. And the last place I would like to take you in May 1945 is Northern Greece. Well, in Northern Greece, May 1945 is like an intermezzo between 2 wars. The Second World War has ended in the fall of 1944, and the Civil War will erupt in March 1946. But May 1945 in Northern Greece is a moment of great insecurity, especially for the Slav minorities, some of whom welcomed the Bulgarian occupiers, others who joined the communist resistance and their promises of cultural autonomy. Well, these Slav Macedonian Greeks will also massively leave this area, 250,000 of them in the years to come. So 1945, May 1945, is a continent on the move. Different Europeans find themselves in different places, or even if they stayed in the same place, this has become a very different place. And I think that that is what unifies May 1945 in the European experience. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. What I would like to add is Sétif in French Algeria, where the French troops, gendarmerie and army massacre local Algerians, more or less starting the war about Algeria, which ended many years later. So this aspect of decolonization is also an important one in this context. But now let's get back to Europe. Tatjana, how did European societies look like in May 45?
Whereas Pieter Lagrou has just taken us to the diversity of situations across Europe in May 1945, I think that there are several traits in societies where situations are not the same, but to a certain degree similar. And this is very important, even regarding memories, to bear in mind. One of the first things is to bear in mind that Europe, wherever war has been, and in all the countries that have been occupied by the Nazi Wehrmacht, Europe virtually lies in ruins. This might be different for parts of what was the Protectorate and Denmark, but elsewhere, large parts of ruins are virtually destroyed. If we think of Warsaw, which after the Warsaw Uprising is a destroyed city, or if we turn to the Soviet Union, about 1,700 cities were totally destroyed, and about 70,000 villages were destroyed as well. Destroyed were cities along the Atlantic coast in France, but if we look to northern Norway, towns like Kirkenes was one of the mostly bombarded cities in occupied Europe or during the war. So large parts of Europe are destroyed, and aside from those people on the move, even people who stayed where they had been in the years before, the number of homeless people is enormous. You had about 6.5 million homeless children on Soviet soil, but a further 1.3 million homeless children in France. So losing home, having no home, and being homeless is among what are problems for societies all over Europe. Another issue to be addressed is that even under occupation, societies had to live through scarcity and especially hunger. Of course, this situation does not change in May 1945. Peter has just mentioned the hunger winter in the winter of 1944-45 in the Netherlands. The situation was dear in other countries as well, and not because the war ended does agriculture start to work. So scarcity is still there, rationing is still there. In countries like Britain, rationing only starts after the war and is going on until 1955. So there is scarcity all over Europe. Another issue to be mentioned, and it can be seen when Peter hinted at a continent on the move, is that families were torn and many of them never to be reunited. So children lost their fathers at the fronts. They lost their mothers because they were deported to slave labor. Especially Jewish families were torn. And many Jewish survivors who survived the Shoah came back as the only ones of their former families. Those Jews who survived in parts of the Soviet Union, when after the war they came back to Poland, for example, they remember being stared at because a Jewish family with a mother and father and 1 or 2 children was something that was no longer known to many people. So the social situation is in many European countries after the war one of destitution. And even though the word is a modern one can assume that many of those who were concerned would nowadays be called traumatized. They survived war, they survived a lot of violence, but they survived humiliation as well, degradation as well. And in countries like the Soviet Union, in Poland, in former Yugoslavia, in Greece, in France, in Belgium, in the Netherlands, in Norway, the losses of the civilian population were higher than that of the combatants. So this was a war of occupation, yeah, and I think this is very important to bear in mind. And this war of occupation leads to a very mixed set of emotions after the war. This is overboarding joy and happiness, part of which Peter hinted at, but it is something that historians call moral panic as well. And there is another issue that is, we might come to that, revenge and retribution. So we have social problems of many kinds, we have torn families, and we have societies which by nowadays standards would be called traumatized. I think these are some of the, not sameness, but similarities that many European situations were to be described by. Thank you.
Thanks. Speaking about emotions, Olga, what could you say about the emotions which followed the May 9th and the victory parade in Moscow on June 24th in this former Soviet Union?
Well, I should say that in the Soviet Union, the situation was the same as all over Europe. Of course, the war was a very difficult experience, but it was very different experience for different groups of population. However, if we speak about authorities, they did their best to create the myth of the war based on the story of a peaceful, peace-loving nation that was attacked by the enemy, and about the nation that consolidated around the wise leader and was able to won liberty for itself and for a large part of Europe. And the parade you're mentioning was a part of the story, and I think that it was a very emotional episode, and it was, of course, the beginning of the myth about the victory. When I say myth, I do not mean that it's not true. I just mean that it's some focused truth, something that is emphasized and something that is downplayed. Yes, the parade took place in June, on the 24th of June, and it was the largest military parade in the Soviet history. It lasted over 2 hours. The day was rainy and the weather was not good. However, it was a great parade. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, who had formally accepted the German surrender to the Soviet Union, and Konstantin Rokossovsky rode through the parade ground on white and black stallions, respectively. According to Zhukov's memoirs, Stalin had intended to ride through the parade himself, but he decided not to do it. So it was Zhukov who commanded the parade. But Stalin stood at the mausoleum of Lenin, and when in the end of parade the NKVD soldiers carried the banners of Nazi Germany and threw them down to mausoleum, it looked like they are throwing these banners to Stalin's feet. So there was some symbolic drama in this. I should say that these kinds of things about playing victory as drama started not in 1945 to raise the mood to victory, to raise mobilization, salutes that celebrating big victories of the Red Army took place. And it should be said that a year before the victory parade in June 1944, Moscow witnessed the parade of about 50,000 of German prisoners who were sent through Moscow. And it was filmed. There is film screening the victory parade in 1945, and there is the film screening the parade of German prisoners in 1944, which were important to demonstrate people the will to win the war. But I should say that in the Soviet Union, the history of commemoration was a rather complicated one, because June 1945 was the last time Stalin celebrated the victory with the parade and as a great holiday. He avoided to do it anymore, and in 1948, the 9th of May ceased to be a day off. Of course, it was Victory Day, everybody remembered about it, but it was a working day, so people were expected to work as usual. They needed to reconstruct economy, they needed to rebuild their families. There were a lot of discussions why Stalin did it. There were different suggestions. Some historians argued that Stalin was afraid of popular mobilization driven by the war. He was afraid that veterans will raise some grievances using this mobilization protest. Some people argue that Stalin was unwilling to support popularity of military commander. I think that probably all these arguments can work, but to my mind, it's also because of traumatic experience. It's very difficult to commemorate the event that is connected to fresh traumatic experience of different kinds. It made sense just to let people to commemorate privately in small groups without having pompous official celebrations. And interestingly, that the 9th of May as a great holiday comes back or is created in Brezhnev's time. It was in 1965 that the holiday was actually constructed on the 9th of May. The military parades were held not every year, but every Jubilee year. And it was in Brezhnev's period that the huge infrastructure of commemoration of the Victory Day was constructed. This infrastructure is still in work, and of course, in post-Soviet period, there also were some important transformations, but I believe that we'll probably speak about it some later.
Thank you. An astonishing parallel to France, where Victory Day was also recalled, so to speak, and then reinterpreted. But we'll come back to that later. And now we are speaking about multinational states like Soviet Union, Yugoslavia. And Božo, let's come back to Yugoslavia.
Yes, of course, thank you for inviting me. I'm in House of the European History, and greetings to all Europeans and everyone else who follows us online. It's sunny in Ljubljana, the beauty studios opened today, so a lot of people, feel like a victory day. Let me first recall the well-known historical fact that there are first causes and then there are the consequences. So I will talk about the causes and then a little bit about consequences. We are talking about a time which Keith Love denoted in his book, The Savage Continent, approximately so. We are talking about a time in which Europe was demolished, in which the principle of collective guilt was applied, in which the principle of collective guilt was applied not just during the time of war, but what is important also after the war. It is the Europe of massacres, the time of most numerous mass migrations in modern history, the time of planned expulsion of German minorities, and the time in which the Cold War emerged. For Yugoslavia, it should be noted that at the beginning of the war, it's slightly different situation like in other countries which were mentioned here, maybe with exception of Soviet Union, as you mentioned, but it was in different position. So in April 1941, it was swiftly conquered by Axis forces and partitioned between Germany, Italy, Hungary, Bulgaria, and client regimes. The country ceased to exist. Its territories became either formally or informally part of the occupying countries, or were ruled by quisling regimes, that or other sort. Ustasha fascist protectorate was established in Croatia. At that time, few believed that Yugoslavia could be restored. The Yugoslav government in exile was only recognized by the Allied powers. The other countries, especially Axis countries, did not recognize it. So what was the result of the war? Because I think that we're talking about the legitimacy of different regimes after the Second World War in Europe, and here, of course, is the question of Titoism. So the result was a partisan Allied victory led by communists, defeat of Nazi Germany in the Balkans, defeat and overthrow of independent state of Croatia and other Axis collaborators, abolishment of the Yugoslav monarchy with Serbian king, and establishment of Federal People's Republic of Yugoslavia. Talking about the figures, what was mentioned briefly. The Yugoslav partisan movement has been operated since July 1941 and grew into the largest resistant force in occupied Europe. That was some 800,000 men and women and 4 field armies at the end. With the exception of the eastern part of the country and Belgrade, where the Red Army participated in limited and agreed operation, and what is important, after that left the country. the partisans liberated the entire Yugoslav territory, including Carinthia in Austria and Littoral and Trieste in Italy. So the war in Yugoslavia lasted 4 years and resulted in over 1 million of casualties, where it had about 16 million population in that time, inhabitants in that time. The state also sustained a large material damage, of course, like everywhere in Europe. It was practically demolished. So what was the reasons for this high human toll in Yugoslavia? Firstly, here are occupation forces and Quisling's military operations, which have systematically killed civilians, shooting hostages, sending people to concentration camps, etc. All these well-known facts. Yugoslav nations, especially Slovenians and Serbs, were considered as Untermensch. Slovenians were supposed to have disappeared as a nation within 6 months after the occupation, while fearful massacres have been carried out over Serbs as well. Secondly, there was genocide, or at least systematic extermination of large number of people for political, religious, or racial reasons. The most numerous victims were Jews and Serbs killed by Ustaša, but Croats and Muslims were also killed by Serbian Chetniks. And similar situations are found among other nations and inside of them throughout all Yugoslavia. So there was very harsh civil war either. The terrible occupation, Ustaša and Chetnik terror, as well as civil war and the class dimension of the resistance movement therefore resulted in mass killings and other atrocities after the war. In principle, and now we are coming to the question of Tito's authorities, Tito repeatedly declared amnesty for some of these, or for all of these defeated groups after the war. But in reality, Tito, things go out of the hands. This does not mean that the command for killings did not come from the most of the top. It means from the Tito. But majority of the killings there happened more like everywhere in Europe at the end of war in May and June. So my opinion is, given that the situation, that post-war killings were important, of course, but they did not threaten the establishment of the regime. It was sensitive time, and it was maybe more the question of reputation of this new regime, but we can discuss this later. What is also important to emphasize is that the Second War in Europe ended at the most northern part of Yugoslavia, to be precise, in my country, Slovenia. The violent clashes here lasted for another week after German capitulation, which is why the war ended in Yugoslavia and Slovenia on May 15. And this was the day celebrated separately as the end of Second World War. So, of course, as addition to May 9th, but it was a separate and important event. In the very small territory of northern eastern Slovenia, the entire German army group E from Balkans and tens of thousands Quislings, members of various Quisling units, were concentrated, killing, raping, robbing, burning villages, torturing civilian population along the Alway. The German army surrendered to Slovene partisans, it means to Yugoslav army, but the Quisling did not want to, which led to severe armed clashes during this short period, and of course revenge. So this is quite specific situation, which is maybe not usual in other countries. And now very briefly I will end with this. How was accepted this victory? What meant in the new socialistic system? How was connected to it? Both the victory and the revolution, because this is the joint project, were the foundation on which Tito based and consolidated his power. Politics was based on the motto of brotherhood and unity. In everyday life, the linking of the legitimacy of power to victory in Second World War was demonstrated mainly through holidays that were almost without exception linked to the resistance and emergence of the new Yugoslavia. The main holiday commemorated the second session of ANO, that is Anti-Fascistic Council of Liberation of Yugoslavia, on 29th November 1943, in which it was established the new federal Yugoslavia. There were also holidays associated with armed resistance and Tito's birthday. Why Tito's birthday? Tito's birthday was named a youth day because young people of both sexes carried the weight of the resistance movement and post-war reconstruction of the country. Remembrance was also commemorated through monuments, celebrations, fine arts, films, and they cemented the myth of resistance. There are two battles of Neretva and Sutjeska rivers in 1943, which were central themes. Also in the two most famous Yugoslav films, in one of which Richard Barton portrayed Tito. So that was the complete system which was connected of celebrations and of course political and other events which cemented the power of authorities. What happened after Tito's death? All this was given away, and political and other discussions about inter-ethnic atrocities during the Second World War fueled inter-ethnic conflicts, and this led to another war. Thank you.
Yeah, I think this shows to all of us what importance these events of, say, Spring 45 and what happened before mean for Europe today. And now I would like to come back to another point, starting perhaps with Peter and Tatjana. We have this phenomenon that in the elections of 45, which take place in Denmark, France, Italy, no, not in Italy, Denmark, France, I think also in Belgium, the communists multiply the number of mandates in parliamentary assemblies all over the country. In Eastern Europe, we don't have anything comparable because there are no free elections. We don't know how communists could have multiplied their number of mandates. So let's start with Peter. What about the shift to the left?
I think this corresponds to what Tatjana had been explaining. The Second World War has been a moment of tremendous hardship and also an experience of collapsing states. And what most people aspire to after the Second World War is not just national liberation, but it's also social liberation. And it is very important to see how during the war, very ambitious programs of social reform are being formulated. The Beveridge Plan in Britain, but also this very social program of the French Resistance Council. And so it's very important to see that the big socio-economic changes occur in Britain, occur in France, long time before they occur in Central and Eastern Europe. So there is very much this idea that you cannot trust capitalism, you cannot trust the free markets to rebuild a continent that has been destroyed. The state has to take a very central role. We need a welfare state. And it is, in a way, very interesting that this springs up, in a way, spontaneously, a bit everywhere in the European continent, at a time when, after all, there is no peace treaty. I mean, the peace of 1945 is a very cynical peace. The decisions taken in Potsdam are about dividing territory, expelling populations. And there is no peace treaty. And if we think of the end of the First World War, the Treaty of Versailles is often criticized as the diktat of Versailles, but the Treaty of Versailles is a very high-spirited text, full of utopian thoughts about self-determination, about democracy, and about social reform. It is about the working week. It is about equal pay between men and women. So where a big part of aspirations for social reform came in the form of international treaties after the First World War, after the Second World War, it clearly does correspond to what the people want. And so communist electoral scores are just one sign of this, but behind the communist victories are socialist victories, and even the mainstream and even the right wing will all call for a new, stronger state, a more just society. And this then will create a tremendous progress towards more equality in Europe in the decades that will follow. So it is certainly a shared aspiration for more social justice all over the European continent.
I think this idea is one of the most inspiring I heard in the last days, because it reminds us of the situation today, where a strong national state granting equality, more or less, is a thing very much wanted by citizens. Tatjana.
Shall I go on this topic? I mean, wanted by the citizens. Speaking from Germany, the debate is whereas in the first weeks of the corona crisis, the large majority wanted a strong state and accepted the rules and regulations, accepted the lockdown. The situation now has changed, not just a little bit, because the debate on do we still need the lockdown, which measures of the lockdown do we need, is our freedom considered within the lockdown, do we have to get out of the lockdown to save our freedom? So at least for Germany, the actual situation with the coronavirus pandemic taking a not that harsh development like in Spain or Italy or in other countries, France, I think the discussion is still there. But I think what helps us to understand is that there are certain situations where a strong state is wished for and is considered a good thing. And it is like Peter mentioned it, there was a need for welfare state. And if I go back to the early post-war years, I mean, it is not just that, as Peter mentioned it, you cannot trust capitalism. The other issue was that, which might come as a surprise to some from nowadays perspective, there was a strong call for planning, not just in Eastern European countries, but in Western European countries as well. It is sure that by planning, every country meant something different, yeah? So planning in Britain was virtually about control. And planning in Italy was about the structures that survived from the fascist times were now the power basis, so to speak, for other parties than before. And this was, of course, something very different from what planning meant in the Soviet Union. But still, this element of planning and this decision that huge investments are needed, which might resemble the situation nowadays. Yeah, huge investments are needed. And where do these investments go? And though different in degree, but generally they went into heavy industry in the early post-war years. As I mentioned, Europe lay in ruins, so these investments were needed. And whether East or West, investments into consumer goods came slowly, came much later, and populations, whether in the Eastern European countries or in the Western European countries, were not heavy with this. After having or enduring scarcity, people wanted their share of the good times, so to speak. So the welfare state Peter spoke about developed slowly, and it took years to develop the welfare state. So maybe this is a round circle from today back to the post-war years, and with some hints for today's developments as well.
Thanks. Olga, what would you say about this motive in how to run a modern state?
Well, of course, from the side of the Soviet Union, the discussion about this turn to the left in post-war years had a different arrangement. It was strongly believed that it was the Soviet experience that became so attractive for other people. And the fact that leftist parties and movements were quite visible in politics of many European countries was interpreted in terms that a movement towards communism is a kind of historical law. Marxism is right, and the Soviet Union is the most advanced country who started first this difficult route. However, it should be said that at least, of course, post-war years were a very difficult time, and actually, even later, even in 1960s, the Soviet Union found itself in a difficult position, and it was clear that investing a lot of resources to Cold War, to keeping strategic balance with the United States of America, the Soviet Union was not able to provide a good supply of consumers' goods. And I would say that much later, in 1980s, when Perestroika started, one of the most important changes in mass consciousness was the recognition of the fact that the belief in planned economy, the belief in our way to communism, that was so important for legitimation of the Soviet rule, actually failed. And suddenly, probably not suddenly, but it became very visible. It became sort of legal, to speak this way. People found that the level of consumption, the quality of consumption in the Soviet Union is far behind not only Western capitalist Europe, but even some countries of Eastern communist Europe. And it was important for delegitimization of the Soviet regime. And by the way, it was a huge trauma for post-Soviet period, because it was very difficult for people, particularly for elder generations, to accept the fact that what people were very proud of, what they believed they have as the nation that won Nazism, actually is not true. And actually the regime, they invested so many money to so many efforts to construct the regime to which they truly believed, actually is not the future of the whole humankind. And I would say that in the 1980s, late 1980s, the whole picture totally put upside down, and people start thinking in quite different ways. So what was a matter of pride and of confidence in the way in the politics that Communist Party conducted in the Soviet Union finally turned to be a trauma of failure, historical failure that this regime has experienced.
My question is, sorry, do you hear me? My
Yes.
question was about the current state.
Do you mean nowadays in terms of coronavirus pandemic?
Yes, yes.
Well, I'm afraid we are rather far from the moment when any discussion of how can we stop these quarantine measures can take place, because now the number of people who got coronavirus rose quickly. We are far from plateau, and we can only start suggestion how it will be later. I would say that it's a thorny moment, because it should be said that the regime came to the pandemic situation in, I would say, a little bit transforming situation, because in the beginning of this year, Putin initiated changes in the constitution, amendments to the constitution, that finally resulted in amendments that allow him to start count his terms from the beginning. So now he can stay in power, I would say, for 12 more years. And in April, on the 22nd of April, there must be people not vote. It's a kind of survey, I would say, because it doesn't have any legal power, but still it's important for legitimation. And of course, it didn't take place, and it was postponed. Now we somehow in a situation when many things, many symbolically important things about the regime are postponed, because this survey about constitutional amendments is postponed. We don't know till what time. And if we speak about the 9th of May, actually celebrations prepared for the 9th of May were not cancelled in Russia. Putin said that definitely 75th anniversary of the victory in war is very important for us, and we cannot cancel celebration. So it will take place, he said, when the coronavirus will be survived. So in a sense, we are in a situation of making a kind of postponing these events. Yes, of course, in the society there are a lot of discussions about effectiveness of the state's policy. Of course, the health care system was transformed recently, and this transformation was not probably for better, because we can see that it's difficult for our medical system to survive with this crisis. However, I would say that ironically, the situation with virus makes things pretty similar in many countries of the world, because people have the same concerns with healthcare, with self-isolation, with lockdown, with failure or collapse of economy and other things. And yes, of course, a lot of discussions.
Božo, 3 is, I tried to count it. It's about 2%.
You mean connection between Yugoslavia and nowadays situation? I can find something.
Okay, your country is much smaller than the Russian Federation.
Yeah, well, yeah. First, about strong state. It's hard to be strong state with 20,000 square kilometers and 2 million, you know. But concerning authoritarianism, it's the same as in the other countries, and we are unfortunately very close to Hungary nowadays. But I will rather speak about welfare state where Peter and Tatjana finished. I think that the challenge is quite the same as it was after Second World War. You know, here are on one side expectations that we will go back as it was, and on the other side that from this Corona crisis will completely new society erased. In history, as you all well know, it's never so. It's a mixture of everything. So it is important if it will prevail the old system or it will prevail the new system in this mixture. I think this is very important. And from Yugoslav experiment, of course, we cannot learn nothing or much from the country which disappeared in blood twice. But Yugoslav self-management system, Titoism, had some good sides. One of them was strong economic democracy, that's self-management, where workers cooperated the factories. The other was social secure for population, security for population, good health care. Now, full employment, which is not achievable anymore, of course. But there are some things which might be useful in the future. But basically, I think that this is the question: what will prevail? To go back in the same system, or to use opportunity and change the system and find something better?
Now we've got very several and different answers to the question how coronavirus relates to May 8th or 9th. Blandine, could you give us some questions?
Maybe in the meantime, I can, while waiting for questions from the audience, add something. I think, in a way, ever since 1945, people have been waiting for another 1945. That is a big crash, a big foundational moment, the big reset, putting all the counters on zero and start all over again. This is what people expected that 1989 might have been. One came down, so it's another 1945. Then other people, well, with the terrorist attacks, 9/11 is another 1945. The financial collapse in 2008 is another 1945. Now maybe Corona crisis, another 1945. But I think there is a strong craving for a big moment of rupture and a radical new start. I think we're all somehow hoping that we can have a radical new start without having to go through a real world war. And that might be some of the expectations, and maybe some of the expectations behind the coronavirus is this is the disaster on a scale of magnitude big enough to bring the big reset we're all hoping for.
Thanks. Blandine?
Yes, good evening. Thank you very much for all your interventions. I collected a few questions from our audience who is following us on YouTube, and I will now share them all with you. I have 4 of them and let you decide afterwards which one you would like to answer in which order. We got first a question from Dr. Joaf Schemmer-Kunz from the University of Strasbourg, who was asking, did the Cold War and the Iron Curtain were they already strongly felt and understood in May 1945, or did this only come months or even years later? So this is our first question addressed to the whole panel. We received then a question from Miriam Meda.
No, let's start with the first one.
Fine.
I guess I can answer, Peter can answer, Tatjana can answer, whoever wants to. Should I start?
Yeah, that would be good.
I think that in April 45, two Allied forces have met somewhere in Saxonia. They were allies and ideological enemies. Two totally different civilization projects. So the Cold War was not planned, it just evolved. Still, it was foreseeable that these two half-European powers, the USA and the Soviet Union, they had to clash over Germany, basically. And then with all the other things we know from the Cold War. So it was in a way inevitable. Peter or Tatjana or whoever wants.
Tatjana?
I can go on, and I think the basic basic things Włodzimierz Borodziej just mentioned. So it depends on what perspective you take. If you take a politician's perspective in the Allied countries, then there was, of course, with the conferences, there was growing skepticism, there was growing mistrust. This is one part of the history. But if you remember what we were just talking about in our discussion, if you take the perspective of, so to speak, normal people on the street, they were in many countries not considering an Iron Curtain. They were not considering that something which would be called later on Cold War would be part of their everyday life. They were considering how to go on with their everyday life in the context of their hardships that they went through and the hardships that were still there. So it is very much a question of perspective and whether it is high politics or, so to speak, I'm tempted to say real people or normal people on the streets.
I think what is so fascinating about 1945, May 1945, is precisely that it could have gone different ways, and thinking that the Cold War was there and inevitably had to come is missing the enormous opportunities of the moment of May 1945. I think it's very important to understand that in May 1945, we avoided a third World War. The conflict did not happen, and the war was still going on, and the Soviet Union and the United States would join in the final campaign against Japan. So I think things could have gone different ways, and if the Cold War came about, it is probably because of a climate of lack of trust on both sides, and there might have been terribly missed opportunities in the months following May 1945. And certainly the Cold War was, I do not think, inevitable.
Well, on the other side, there was intentions to prolong friendship for 20 years or something. So there was some sort of solution in the middle. From war to one side, to friendship another side, and there was at the end Cold War.
There was a famous article in the 1980s, I think, Paths Not Taken, which were, say, memoranda from the State Department of the USA that we could somehow cooperate with the Soviets. Didn't turn out. No, I think this was inevitable. Here I would, in one of the very few cases, disagree with Peter, that this was a clash of systems which happened after the victory over the common enemy. And hardly I cannot imagine a Soviet Union which would have come to terms with the USA, and they were dominating. Now who's next? No one? Blandine, next question, please.
I can share now a question that comes from Michael Holmes from the European School of Politics in Lille, who is asking, how many Europes do you think existed in 1945? And what were these different Europes? Is it just East and West, or is it more complex?
Who'll start?
Well, I can say that at that moment was East and West, and from 48 onward there was also Yugoslavia, which was between the country with open borders on both sides, you know, and semi-market system and so on. So there was, and general in the world, of course, you know, there was non-aligned movement between both blocks. So it was not just black and white. But immediately after the war, yes, Yugoslavia was also on this Soviet side of the curtain.
Yes, I would say that's the basic difference between today and 1945, that now we have much more of a division between South and North than between East and West. Who's next?
I think there's another risk of anachronism here. Obviously, there was a Soviet occupation zone and there was a Western occupation zone, and that will prove in the months to come to be a very important divide. But if we take divisions in terms of experience of war, we get a very different map. For instance, if we talk of the war on the East, what are we talking about? We're talking about Poland and Ukraine, to a lesser extent the Baltic countries, but countries we tend to see as Eastern Europe, take Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, they used to be Hitler's allies. So they are not part of this Eastern Front experience of Ukraine and Poland, or if they are part, they're fighting on the side of the Germans. So for a very long time, the experience of Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria have nothing in common with Ukraine or Poland. So to create some homogeneous East European experience, I think is highly problematic. Or if we take Yugoslavia, Albania, and Greece, they very much share the same war experience. And in a way, by the sheer coincidence of a stroke of the pencil of Churchill and Stalin, they end up in different spheres of influence. In all logic, the events in Greece would have followed the events in Yugoslavia and Albania, was it not for British intervention. So East and West, I think we have to be very cautious with this. And it certainly does not reflect homogeneous war experience.
And maybe what's more, what we would today consider a part of the West, like Spain and Portugal. Yeah, it's not part of the West in this sense in 1945. Yeah, so this is a kind of geography that developed when I started my part of the talk with talking about similarities. I was trying to say that there is a Europe that is based on experiences, and there are experiences that are based on the, so to speak, ground experience of occupation and countries which were not occupied because they were allies or because they were stay neutral, Switzerland, whatever neutral means in this regard, but not being part of the warfare and not being part of the occupation. So there are several countries who do not fit into this usual narrative, and it is a narrative which constructs East and West, and which kind of I'm looking for words which kind of there is a subtext to what is East and what is West, what is good and what is not so good, and things like this. And I think it is very important to pay attention to this and to bear in mind that with all the heterogeneity, there are some basic experiences which are not that different altogether. And I think what we hadn't had in our discussion, maybe Blandine has a question of this for us, but we have not at all spoken on gender relations so far. We have not at all spoken on, is this a Europe of women? Is the Europe of women in 1945 a different one from that of men? And I would say it is definitely so. So maybe there is a question to this, or maybe we come back to that, but I think we should take this into account as well.
Maybe just one other point. If we make distinctions in Europe in 1945, there are those countries where in 1945 the worst was finished. And there are those countries where 1945 basically is when the worst is still coming. And I think that is an essential divide that does not coincide with East and West. Certainly for Germany and Austria in 1945, the worst was yet to come. And the same can be said for Hungary. For Poland, the worst was definitely over.
Well, you know, European Union is only one part of Europe, so Europe is wide term. We also have countries which are not part of European Union today, and the question is, especially Balkans, for example, and the question is, what will happen with them? And also, what's here comparison with the situation in 45? In that time, there was some expectation for better world, but today it's hard for them.
True. What I would like to stress is that I very much regret that we haven't invited a speaker from one of the Baltic countries who would say something totally different than we speak about. Countries which surrendered to the Soviet Union, later had a lot of collaboration. The elites were totally destroyed. And then for 44 years, they became, no, 45 years, they became parts of an empire they never wanted to belong to. Okay, next time a speaker from Latvia, Lithuania, or Estonia. Blandine, next question. Is there anything about gender?
There is no question or remark about gender. Sorry. I have 3 more questions or remarks. The one I will share now is from Sasha Rajacic, who is asking, could you please tell us something about one topic which is not often represented, people's view on the state and its authority in 1945. And he goes on saying many countries were occupied or abolished during the Second World War. The continent was in ruins. How did states come back to life and restore law and order?
I guess this question goes to Tatjana first.
I'm not quite sure whether I understood you correctly, but the question is about the view of state and authorities in 1945.
Yes, it's sort of in 2 parts, but the first part is how did people view the state and its authority, the state and state authority in 1945?
Yeah. This is a very complex question, and it is not that easy to answer in this huge European variety, because if you go back to the years of occupation, wherever you were in occupied Europe, the German occupiers tried and usually got hold of the police and used the police for their occupation policies, especially for signing in the population, for seeing who is of Jewish origin, for organizing deportations. So collaborationist groups within the police were in all the countries in East and West. We have long had a debate that these so-called collaborationist groups have only been part of Western and Northern European countries, and that with the German occupation, all infrastructure regarding authorities in Poland, the occupied Soviet Union, and so on were basically erased. which we nowadays know that wherever the occupiers arrived, they needed this kind of structure, and partly forced people to act within the administrations on their behalf, and partly if you lived, for example, say in occupied Ukraine, and you lived in parts where the hunger reigned, then working for an administration was a good idea to get money, to get food, and to be in the warmth. So, and with these modern speaking control freaks the Nazis were as occupiers, all the administration gained a huge number, a huge plus in numbers working for them. So there is this kind of collaborationist situation. And this, of course, on the one hand side, led to a certain kind in mistrust in these people. On the other hand, with changing the tide of the war, with those who were seeing that the Nazis would not win the war, the amount of people in the police who, for example, in the Netherlands or in Belgium, you had these deportation for labor. Mayors were forced to put the quotas together, but on the other one hand side, they put these quotas together, and on the other hand side, they warned those who would be sent to Germany beforehand. So they adopted strategies of fulfilling German tasks and at the same time not fulfilling them. So there is an ambivalence in how these people handled their situation. When we go into the immediate post-war years, then governments in exile coming back to their countries were quite aware that they would need police, mayors, city administrations, and so on. They would need this hierarchy. So the number of these people really tried for collaboration. I'm not saying it was small, but not everyone was tried, because to build up the state, and as Peter and myself have mentioned earlier, there was huge trust in the state as such, because people were so needy in many regards that, as Peter, as Tony just posted, between the individual and the destitution, there was only the state. So the state was very much needed, and the answer is therefore one of ambivalence. Or Peter, maybe you want to add.
What is common? Sorry, what is common is we started with the change of political elites. Mostly political elites change, and they lasted till the student and other rebels in 60s, 80s, the same generation.
I think what is striking, first of all, that 1939, 1940 are everywhere seen as the collapse and the total failure of the parliamentary regime. Parliamentary regime is weak, is rotten, and now comes the time of the new order. We need strong governments, we need strong authority. In 1945, of course, the new order has failed, but that doesn't mean that people want simply to go back to parliamentarism as we had known it in the 1930s. Some of this profound discredit of this liberal bourgeois democratic regime is still there in 1945. So we still want a strong state, but with constitutional liberties and guarantees. We certainly do not want a new order with its authoritarianism or with grave violations of human rights, but we do not want to go back to parliamentarianism as we had known it. And especially May 1945 becomes the triumph of the strong state. For instance, one of the big challenges is repatriation. Now, bringing back citizens by airplane shows how strong the state is, how the state can save population. So there is no full scale back to the 1930s at all. There is an idea, we still need a strong state, but to do something different from what the German Nazi-controlled states did. Strong states that produce more human rights, but certainly also more welfare.
Olga Malinova.
Well, I'm afraid I cannot add so much because, as you remember, I'm not a historian of war period or post-war period. I'm
Okay.
competent to give.
Now we've got to Blandine, and
Yes.
maybe the last question.
I have still two more, so will I? Should
Okay, so two at once, and then we'll answer.
So one came from Miriam Meda, and she's asking, what are the reasons right after the Second World War for officially saving Nazis and provide them good lives, mostly in the USA, but also in Latin America? And one last question came from a student at the International School of Brussels, Zara Amici, who is asking, would you say that there is a modern resonance of the spheres of influence decided before the Cold War in modern politics?
First question I didn't really get.
Me too.
Sound was bad.
The first question, I will repeat it. What are the reasons right after the war for officially saving famous Nazis and providing them with good lives, mostly in the USA, but also in Latin America? So these were the last two questions from our participants.
Okay, I would say that the first one is one which is too complicated to answer within 2 minutes. Let's deal with the second. Could you please repeat it?
Sure. Would you say that there is a modern resonance of the spheres of influence decided before the Cold War in modern politics?
Okay. I think this world of 2020 is totally different.
Yeah.
The spheres of influence are also different. They still exist in a certain way. The predominating being the American, the Russian, more or less within the borders of the Russian Federation. China doesn't, in my part of Europe, play a significant role. So I would say this is the bipolar world which George Bush Sr. has dreamed of, with American as the main player. Still, it's not comparable to the Cold War.
I think in terms of spheres of influence, what happens in Europe in, say, the 2 decades after 1945 is that basically many of the big players do not really want to take this role. We can see that Great Britain doesn't want to take up its role as a leader in Europe, and the reconstruction of Europe is basically undertaken by the main losers of the war, by Germany and Italy, obviously, but also by France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, which in many ways are also losers of the Second World War, or certainly not winners, not the ones who contributed most to militarily deciding who won this war. So what happens in Europe is that the big players basically leave it up to nations that are not the victors to come to an agreement and to find ways of rebuilding the continent. And that is probably a quite interesting scenario that developed, and it was quite unexpected. It is neither the United States, nor in the western part of Europe, the Soviet Union, nor Great Britain, who have a leading role. And it is in this uneasy compromise between France, Italy, Germany, and the small European nations that a new constellation emerges.
Well, the order after Second World War established fell apart, it's obviously, but there's no new one, not in the world and also not in Europe.
Well, I think that now we live in a world that is very different from the one that appeared in after 1945. And the major difficulty is that the contemporary world is much more differentiated, and it speaks in different languages. I mean that as I can get it, after the Second World War, politicians argued in much more similar terms and much more similar concepts than what we have now. And the question about spheres of influence is a very good one, because I think that what is peculiar for nowadays is that the very language of spheres of influence is illegitimate, or at least officially illegitimate for major part of the world, and for Europe in particular. So I'm afraid that it's different because there are no clear rules of the game, and there are no language that could be used to come to terms about the contemporary world.
Okay, thank you. And now Blandine sent me a message that she has 2 questions about gender, the last ones in this discussion.
Okay, Tatjana.
While you were talking, some people were active on the chat. I will share them both at once. So we have Lucia Boschetti from the University of Bari in Italy. To what extent was the role of women during the war forgotten immediately after? How important was family for Christian Democrats ruling Western countries? That is the first one. I hope you can hear me well. And the second one, talking of the gender issues of the post-war period, can you elaborate a little about gender orders of the European societies of the post-war period in their relation to the reconstruction of statehood?
I would say that Tatjana starts.
I do. And these are 2 rather broad questions, and I nevertheless try to give not too broad answers. But yes, to a certain degree, I would say that what for a long time has been missing is an awareness for the role of women during war and occupation. Earlier in our debate, we talked about what happened to families. What we should have mentioned even as well is that occupied societies, and to a certain degree war societies as well, were societies of absent men. Yeah, so men were drafted to the military, they were at the front, they were in captivity, they were dead, sometimes wounded, they were drafted to forced labor. So in occupied countries, the majority of people present, especially in towns, were women, children, young persons, and very old people, but men were absent. If you read a diary, like, for example, by Simone de Beauvoir, she writes, "Where are all the men? Nobody is here." Yeah, so this impression is already in the streets that the men are absent. This immediately meant that women had to take over many roles that usually were performed by men, and starting with, they had to earn a living for their families. In many countries, this is of course a question, let's say, if you were working class, then the percentage of women working was much higher. If you were part of the bourgeoisie, having to work was no-go. Yeah, so this is kind of your status would be deeply endangered if the woman had to work. So the role of women was, I wouldn't say forgotten, but I think it could have nevertheless got more attention in historiography as well. And in the last years, we have a growing awareness that on the one hand side, Let's take France. Women who had to work in the situation immediately of summer 1940, the possibility to work was in many cases working for the occupying troops. And these kinds of occupation were very poorly regarded in larger societies. So this idea of family politics, women staying at home, women sacrificing themselves for their families, was very much an issue. And we talked a bit on the situation immediately after 1945, on the trials. Women all over Europe were put to trial because of something that in the times was called horizontal collaboration. So they were put in trials because of whether they had or not had, but were said to have had sexual relations with men. In the Netherlands, a quarter of all those in custody, captivity held were women because of horizontal collaboration or so-called horizontal collaboration. So there is a rollback in the early post-war years with re-establishing traditional family values, with putting women back, so to speak, at home.
Well, sorry, that might be for Western Europe, but not for Eastern and not for Balkans. You know, for Yugoslavia, there was liberation of women. That's definitely during the war. You know, so it's completely different. If that was not so, nowadays rights will be far aside of us. You know, if it was not that, you know, this started, at least starting of emancipation. Nowadays, women's rights will be far away from a nowadays modern society in all former Yugoslav countries.
I think that is maybe what the person who asked the question was hinting at. Indeed, World War II brought some factual women's emancipation, women taking up very new roles, accompanied just after the war in some West European countries by the first time women got the vote in places like France and Belgium, but also with a conservative backlash of precisely European Christian democracy, with a Kinderküche Kirche, so let's send the women back to take care of the children of the kitchen and go to church. And so there was certainly in Western Europe, very differently from Eastern Europe, this conservative backlash, which in part can explain also what will then happen in 1968, which is not a revolution against centuries of male oppression, but also a very specific revolution to this very conservative reconstruction under Christian democratic inspiration in Western Europe.
Yeah, and we had this debate earlier on, what does the actual crisis teaches us and what is about the strong state? I think what we might, I do not know what the situation is in other countries, but for Germany, with the idea of homeschooling that we have now, all the schools are still closed, or just the first one are to be opened up these days in some of the federal states. The statistics is saying that a quarter of the women working full-time, and the number of women working full-time in Germany is lower than in most European countries. A quarter of those women working full-time now reduce due to homeschooling their full-time employments to part-time employments. So I think there are these, I'm not really sure whether I would speak about these factual roles women took during the war, whether I really would speak about emancipation. Much of this was not chosen, much of this was out of necessity. We could debate for Eastern Europe what kind of emancipation this was. I would say a very special kind. We have at the same time, there might be on the upper level emancipating processes combined with backlashes. And I think if I'm to hint at what happens in the present day. I do not know how it is in your countries, but in Germany, there's a quarter of all the women working full-time reducing to part-time due to having to care for the children and their schooling, is something that I would really like to have statistics on for other countries as well. So there is this gender history might not be that obvious, but there is a gender dimension to the things we have debated here today.
Thank you. This was the last questions, Blandine. Now I would like to sum up what Tatjana and Peter said. It's exactly the same process like after November 1918, where women had to work while men, for reasons mentioned by Tatjana, were absent. But what they gain after World War I in most of European countries, sooner or later, is voting rights. I guess after 1945, they get nothing.
Yeah.
So we have drawn a picture, again, pointing to Tatjana, starting from 1918 over 1945 till 2020. Thanks a lot. Tatjana, some
maybe it is even worse. What part of the female population after 1945 or in 1945, or starting even with the view that the Germans would not win the war, is retribution. I mean, the numbers of women tried for their relations with Germans is high in many countries. The sharing of heirs is high in many countries. I'm of course not saying that every woman who had I'm not saying that every woman had a relationship with a German man, and that all of them had to face reprisals, but the number is high. And we have seen this debate from Norway to other countries as well on the children born of war, that not even the women but their children as well were highly stigmatized for a long time, and until these children were old people themselves. So maybe it's even worse than you said, but maybe I'm seeing things too strongly.
Thanks, Blandine.
So this is it with questions from our audience. Professor Borodziej, would you like to say a final word?
No, I thought it's your destination, so to speak.
Okay, then I will.
On behalf of the host.
Definitely, I will, on behalf of the House of European History team, on behalf of my director, Constanze Itzel, who opened the event, I would like to thank you all, each of you who accepted our invitation for this debate. A special thanks to you, Professor Borodziej, for moderating this discussion. Thank you also to my colleague, Johnny Bryan, who has been supporting the whole, the smooth running of this event technically. And I would like to thank very much all our audience, all people who watched, listened, and participated tonight from different places in Europe. Thank you very much. Stay safe and stay tuned on our online channel. Thank you very much.